Okay, all right, we might get started. It's 3 minutes past the hour, so we'd better get into things. Don't want to waste any time. Welcome and thank you for coming today. Sarah and I are going to just share some thoughts to kickstart everything. The idea for this panel came from conversations we were having where we actually agreed. It's not like our conversations about what counts as good television. But we were just talking about some of our experiences in academia and how we've been navigating those issues as women in academia in particular, and some of the differences in experience that some of our male colleagues have, for example, that we've noticed. Perhaps it's speculation, perhaps it's not. And I think this is something that a lot of women in academia have been talking about over time, so we're not talking about anything new. We just thought we'd invite some people who we see as gurus in the field to come and speak a little bit more to their experience as a chance to think through a few of the issues about marginalisation, stereotyping, and just general frustration that go on. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Julie to speak first, and thank you to all our speakers today. But first, Sarah has a few more statistics to go through. Sorry,
no, that's all right. No, I'm okay. Thanks, Kirstie. We just wanted to start a little bit. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. But we just wanted to have a little bit of sort of the background, the sort of sector-wide background, I guess. Thinking about the university as a workplace. And of course, I think we all know that some workplaces do have issues with women, or we might say more broadly, gender continues to be a factor in employment and employment workplace-related experiences. And just for some of the wider context in the university sector more specifically, of course, it's a sector that has an unequal distribution of women and men in positions in general. So I was looking up the statistics yesterday. About 44% of the staff in the university sector are women, but of course at more senior levels, those statistics are much lower. So at level E, it's about a quarter of the staff at level E across the Australian university sector as a whole are women. Of course, there's variations in those statistics according to discipline groups and across institutions. There's quite a bit of research into the reasons behind the lack of women at senior levels of university administration and also senior research and teaching positions. And a lot of it does talk a lot about what we might call the masculinisation of ideas of success and performance. But also, of course, there's talk about women having greater caregiving roles outside of universities. And also there's a bit of talk about lack of mentoring, lack of role models, that kind of issue. But I guess I just also wanted to note that I don't think it's just at the senior levels that there's something to talk about. There are large proportions of staff who are not permanent staff in the sector anymore. So there's an enormous casual and sessional contract workforce, and that is 60% women. So obviously that's also a kind of important part of the context. I'll hand back to Kirstie.
Okay, so with this background, we're hoping to generate some wider discussion today. And we're very grateful to the Contemporary Histories Research Group for allowing this opportunity, and thank David and Philip for helping us to put this together. And we are delighted to have three wonderful speakers today. The first being Associate Professor Julie Evans from the University of Melbourne, where she's an Associate Professor in Criminology, and her research and teaching explores relations between Western laws and Indigenous peoples and reflects her background in history, law and criminology. We also have Professor Katie Holmes from Trobe University, where she is Professor of History and the Director of the Transforming Human Societies Research Focus Area with the Centre for the Study of the Inland. Her research is on environmental history and gender and sexuality. And finally, Professor Joy Damousi from the University of Melbourne, who's a Professor of History and ARC Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellow. Joy also runs the Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Mentoring Scheme, which is for early career women in the humanities and social sciences. And I think, Tiff, you've done that, and I'm not sure.
And Charlotte as well.
Yeah. So that's been wonderful for women across in early career positions especially. So yes, now officially over to you, Julie.
Thanks,
Thank
Kirstie
you.
and Sarah. Thank you both for inviting me. It's great to be here. I think it's about a year ago we had that last wonderful symposium here at Deakin, so it's good to be back. So I just wanted to make 2 points to bring to the conversation. And the first one is a big point, I suppose, about how the predominance of neoliberal concepts and practices in universities and in society more broadly has, I think, exposed the limits of rights-based advocacy for all sorts of justice concerns, not just for women and women in the academy, as we're talking about here, and in society more generally, but how such concerns are experienced across race, class, and a whole heap of other lines. And the second point is how these limits also encourage us, or should encourage us, to develop different conceptual frameworks, I think, in order to prosecute those kinds of justice concerns in institutions and in society more generally. So I'll just talk a little bit about some recent interventions by feminists on that front, and then some examples from how I've tried to seek different conceptual frameworks in my own work and practice in collaboration with others. Okay, so speaking very generally to the first point, I want to focus on how in a managerial university, despite its rhetorical commitment to equality and diversity, the university's become, I think, increasingly rather than less patriarchal, including through its focus on individualism, seeing us as atomised individuals rather than as individuals in relation to each other. So when rights-based discourse is individualised in this way, the history of rights discourse, about which we all as historians should know quite a lot, and the lived experience that underpins it, risks being obscured. I think that's a real danger. And perhaps we've seen that most recently in the kinds of debates that are emerging around the Racial Discrimination Act, and this kind of notion that we're all equals and that there's really no such thing as race anymore. So we as historians know better than many other academics, I think, that there's no such thing as race, but race operates as if it is real. And in the Australian case, for example, it's done, a lot of work over the 200 years before Mabo. So this notion now, we seem to be in a time where commentators can say, well, there's no such thing as race. Indeed, to suggest such a thing and that there might be distinctive rights might in fact be racist in itself. So this is kind of one of the risks, I think, of marrying the rights-based discourse with this notion of individualism. So turning to the second point, what can feminist scholars and historians in particular do to support the development of different conceptual frameworks, I think at this point of time, in the wake of the limits of such individualised rights discourses. And I think Sarah Ahmed obviously is the most prominent example, as well as just most recently resigning from her position at Goldsmiths. She's had a long history of writing in this field about what it's like to be within institutions. And I think her work on being included really brings out that gap between a symbolic commitment to equality and diversity and the actual experience of those who embody that diversity. And indeed how racism in itself can be obscured, even though the university openly commits itself to equity and diversity. And I think we really need to take account of what those feminist theorists are saying and actually doing on that front. I mean, it's her website, I think you probably all looked at Feminist Killjoys, is really amazing in terms of the diversity of its considerations and where it's going from this point onward. So these policy commitments, I think we need to be really careful from, this notion that you can comply to policies, but actually what happens in practice can be a different thing. And obviously Amy Carrillo-Rowe has long been writing about this as well, the importance of being in relation and the politics of being in relation. So just to turn now to some examples of my own work and how I've attempted to work within this notion of a relation-based framework rather than a rights-based framework alone. So the kind of theoretical work that I work with is around critical law. For me, working criminology as a historian, there's nothing that's more important than addressing the relations between Indigenous peoples and the state. It plays out at the pointy end in criminology, like most things do when the state intervenes most clearly, is in the overwhelming overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system, and getting worse 25 years after the Royal Commission. Massively worse, particularly for children and for women. So this is a key priority in my work in crim. The theoretical lens I bring is around critical law, and that is around, again, the notion of lawful relations. And this is a body of work that isn't so much interested in rights-based approaches as in being in relation, coming into relation. So in the Australian case, you could see that the original settlement was unlawful, not just legal in a legal sense, but unlawful in a broader sense. And although that was turned around to some extent in Mabo in the preceding 200 years, of course, that unlawfulness did a whole heap of work, including through race, in the surveillance and dispossession, etc., of Aboriginal people, which we all know very well. So this new critical law framework seeks to redress that unlawfulness by developing a lawful framework within which the state and Indigenous peoples come into relation. So after over 200 years of being negative relation, denying any relation between Indigenous peoples and the state, despite doing all the surveillance and management of them, there is a theoretical framework within which we might understand the importance of the state, institutions and individuals being in relation with Indigenous people. So within sovereign relation, we might think about a contrast between the controversy surrounding amending the Constitution, which still has some symbolic importance, but is very much within a Western framework, within the framework of the state, endowing rights to others, as opposed to a kind of treaty-based framework where you have sovereigns coming into relation. So it's that kind of theoretical framework. So the kind of key scholars there would be Indigenous scholar, jurisprudent Christine Black, and other scholars who work at Melbourne Uni Law, Sean McVeigh and Anne Genovese, and Shauna Dorset from UTS. Also historians, Tony Birch, of course, has long been in this field, talking about the responsibility of settlers to accept the burdens of history, not the Indigenous peoples who have had to carry those burdens for so long. So that kind of theoretical work has informed the practice that I've been involved in collaboration with others, including with Jo from Deakin and Pat Grimshaw from Melbourne, all historians. Other historians, Zoe Laidlaw and Alan Lester from the UK, and myself as a historian criminologist, and Jennifer Ballant and Nathan McMillan from criminology, who are both socio-legal criminology people. So it's an interdisciplinary collaboration that we've been doing a lot of work on with Mark McMillan from the law school. So one of those practices is demonstrating the conceptual shift to being in relation and what are the ethics and possibilities of that kind of collaboration. So through the Minutes of Evidence project, which I won't speak about, but I can answer questions about later, it's a major collaborative project with 13 partners, state, government, education, major cultural institutions, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and communities, etc. This has been a major collaboration which has been about being in relation, and it has had a number of important legacy outcomes, curriculum development in secondary schools in years 9 and 10, performance outcomes for verbatim theatre which we can take to the community, and also research outcomes which are interdisciplinary and collaborative. The purpose of all of that is to not only achieve these kinds of bigger outcomes, but to model being in collaboration, another way of working as an academic, of actually making that theoretical work have meaning in practice, and also within the institution of modelling a different way of working. That is, that you can model the relational within that atomised university model. And I think for the women involved on the project, and there have been a lot of us as women involved in that project, that has really changed how we've thought about working within a university culture that can be otherwise quite alienating. So we've had 6 babies born on our project, for example, in the 5 years that it's been formally going. And 3 of us at least are part-time. Are you part-time, Jo? Mm-hmm. So 4 of us are part-time. So again, the university notionally has commitments to these policies, but the practice of them is a different thing. So having this collaborative framework within which we work, I think we've developed stronger friendships and capacities to work within that framework. And so I was just talking to Nathan about this the other day, and she was speaking, she has 2 little babies now and works part-time, that the difficulties of working as a part-time academic, as a female part-time academic, are really, really considerable. And without our kind of mentoring and support of each other, it would be much, much harder to maintain your commitment, I think, over time. So I think there is a practical benefit there. That doesn't mean we accept the gap, of course, between the symbolic and the experience, but we seek to manage that gap. One way is through that practice, but another way I think is also trying to work for change within the institution itself. So just a brief gesture, just a couple of other projects we're working on is seeking to move the university to adopt not just compliance-based frameworks around Indigenous rights, apparently, in particular, but also this responsibility approach, a relational approach. So can we move beyond compliance obviously complying with the documents, but also beyond compliance, where we get the university to reflect on its own history and to come into relation with Indigenous peoples in Victoria. It's a massive undertaking and it's a big thing, but it is a conceptual shift that I think is important. A couple of others I won't talk about now, but I can talk about later. So, hand over.
Wow. Thanks, Joy. You've that was great and lovely to have that theoretical framing too, which is not what I'm going to talk about at all, really, because in that sense mine's kind of much more prosaic, what I want to say or reflect on, and think and there's two aspects to, I guess, what I want to say. One is to take up the idea of the practice of history, and the other to think about the academy and what happens in that space or that context. And so when I was thinking about my own kind of trajectory as a historian, I was thinking about, my days both as a postgraduate and then, an early career researcher, and I was very much in the feminist history, gender history field, which in itself was a wonderfully supportive space, mostly. And it was vibrant and alive, and there was just fantastic work going on, and we all thought that this was where it was at, as it were. And the kind of shift from women's history into gender history and gender as a category of analysis also then, of course, threw down the challenge that it not just be women, but actually masculinity also gets problematised, that this also has a history, and that men actually also could do, gender history and could take up that challenge. And that, they had bodies and power that could be problematised. And some men rose to that challenge, but actually I think overall very few, and in particular very few straight men, that it was easier for, gay men to recognise the problematisation around sexuality and bodies, etc. And I think what happened then in a kind of historiographical sense was that was an interesting shift to a focus on race, and race being where the interesting work was being done in history. And of course that absolved men from having to think about their gender, and it was much easier to think that they had a race because they could see that in terms of power and colonialism and that kind of thing. So the whole kind of gender critique it wasn't erased, but it became increasingly marginalised, I think, in terms of historiography. And you could see that in the books that are on the shelves. And then, of course, the huge investment in war history just reinforced that whole marginalisation of gender and gender history. And I think that's what, in a sense, where we are now. There's still some fantastic work that's being done, and there's some fantastic work that postgrads are doing, but it's much more marginal than it was, and it's now, and it's easier, I think, again, to publish, sophisticated historical work, but that doesn't think about gender in any problematic way. It's difficult to do that and not think about race, I think, but it's much harder to find good stuff on gender in that sense. And in my own career then, I started to move into environmental history. And what's been so interesting for me in that context is that gender is just completely absent in most environmental history work. And so you get a program at a conference and you search for anything that has gender in it. And interestingly, there's a big European environmental history conference next year, and myself and Ruth Morgan talking about doing a panel on gender and technology. I've started doing some work on masculinity and technology in the context of the environment, and so we put out a call for someone to join us, and there's one woman in the States that's doing stuff around kind of biology and gender in an environmental context, not one taker. and we can't even think of anyone, you know, who we could ask who's working in this space, which I just think is so interesting and so revealing. And it's even more exaggerated. Although there are lots of women working in the area, they're not working around issues to do with gender. And then if you kind of look even at a more narrower section of the environmental history area, which is work on the Anthropocene, you know, that's where all the big boys are playing now. And Libby Robin is probably the only woman who's, you know, regularly speaking in that space. And it's like, that's the big question. That's the way in which they can also be seen, I think, to compete around a science agenda and participate in that science discourse. And I think that that's another interesting aspect to the whole question of gender and the academy. I don't know when any of you saw Claire Wright's posting of Susanna Lipscomb's piece on the AHA Facebook page the other day, but she's just published a blog looking at a case for double standards, and she's looking at feminist history, or women actually, in the historical profession in the UK. And, you know, she's arguing that sexism is endemic within UK, and it's particularly endemic around publishing and the kind of work that is published and the way it is received when it's published by women. And I think, you know, you can say much of the same thing here. I think what happens, though, is a lot of that sexism and discrimination is hidden. And I just want to give you two anecdotes about this. One is from myself. A number of years ago, I was putting in a grant application with a team of people from Monash University. And two of us in the team had interrupted careers because of children, but also children with significant disabilities. And so in our rope section, you know, in the ARC grant, we had mentioned this and the impact of that. And one of the assessors said, given our circumstances, really questioned whether we should be part of this research team. And, you know, it was like one of those things, I can't believe somebody said that. You know, but they did. And that's the things that's hidden. Another example comes from a friend of mine from Ireland who had been working on this absolutely stunning article looking at a letter that a 40-year-old woman wrote to the Archbishop of Dublin in the 1920s. She had been raped as a 40-year-old single woman by the I can't remember whether it was the Irish Republicans or the British. Anyway, she was raped. She became pregnant. She wrote this extraordinary letter to the Archbishop of Dublin asking that the child that she subsequently had, that she could get money so she could have this child adopted out. The child was in a home, and the home was wanting maintenance, basically. Extraordinary letter. And Lindsay's analysis of it was fantastic. She sent it to a couple of journals, and the feedback she received was extraordinary. One of the most shocking of which was from the Journal of History of Sexuality, where she sent this. And the readers' reports came back with a cover note from the editor saying, "I just want you to know we are committed to publishing this article." And one of the readers had said, "Does the author seriously expect us to believe that the rape of a 40-year-old woman is as serious as the rape of a 20-year-old woman?" And I just thought, I mean, you think, how can someone both think that, put it in writing, and be a reader for the Journal of History of Sexuality? So that kind of sexism is out there. It still actually affects people. That's the point I want to make here. And I think in relation to the point that you've already made, Julie, about the challenges for women with children, I think that's also one of the issues that's really prevalent in terms of careers, the kind of how you manage an interrupted career, particularly when you're applying for jobs, and what it looks like on your CV and how you handle all those. There's real issues there. I'm running out of time. The other thing I just wanted to touch on was the academy, and I think that by that I mean the kind of university sector, and in my role as director of this research focus area, I've now had spent a lot of time in senior meetings within the university. And what's so striking, I mean, apart from the statistics around the ratios of gender, and so disproportionate at the A level where women predominate, and then at the E level where men predominate, is the kind of what I would call the role of the God professor, and the way in which the God professor is seen, and the extraordinary lengths that universities will go to buy them, the amount they will pay to have them on their staff. They're mostly scientists. It's very difficult. The idea of the God professor in humanities, I think, is nowhere near as prevalent, and you don't often see universities competing, wanting to fork out large sums of money to get God professors in the Australian context, at least, I think. That may be changing. But then what that means in the context of the voice and the kind of gravitas that they carry, which comes back to the whole, like Trump keeps going on about Clinton not looking presidential enough. It's a similar kind of policy, or not policy, but prejudice at work. And I think women really struggle to project that kind of gravitas and struggle to be heard in the same way, and we self-censor all the time because we don't want to be seen to be difficult, and the fact that this is being recorded, of course, means that we're all self-censoring as well. And I think the other thing that is so obvious within the university structure is the way in which senior men can carry on their research careers because more junior women are prepared to carry the administrative load, and therefore effectively do that, both that administrative housework but also the emotional work that happens within any department, and that frees up the God professors, but just senior men, to pursue their research careers in ways that women are less able to. And in the case of humanities and social sciences at Trobe, we now have a college structure, and we have schools within the colleges, and so humanities, social science is now a school. We've got 6 heads of department, and 5 of them are women. And I just think that says it all. I mean, on the one hand, it says a lot about the fact that there's a lot more women and competent women, actually, but it's also that those people are putting up their hands for those kinds of positions. That's all. I've said enough.
Lucky last.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Kath, for the invitation. Thanks, Julie and Katie. They were great. So I just want to identify sort of really 3 issues. Some of them have been covered by Julie and Katie. It's the wonderful thing about coming last. The first is Sarah sort of asked me to talk a little bit about my mentoring scheme. So I think I'll do that, because I guess what I want to talk about is what we do to address some of the issues. And Julie and Katie have brilliantly articulated some of the challenges, but how do we address them? So when I was in a fortunate position of receiving a laureate fellowship, I was keen to take up the Kathleen Fitzpatrick aspect of that, which is to develop a mentoring program. And the way that works in the ARC is that you come up with something. They give you no direction or sort of guidance. It's really up to you. So when I was faced with this challenge of coming up with mentoring, I thought, well, it has to be beyond meeting with people and having coffee and reading their work and so on. So I went and did some research around what was on offer from every university in this country. And of the 39 universities, not one, I should emphasise, had a proper mentoring program for early career, mid-career women. Not one of them. They had a morning or an afternoon tea or a drinks or a meet professors, meet women, meet whoever you like. But there was no systematic program, and I thought, I don't believe this. I think that's pretty stunning. So that then sort of gave me the confidence to develop a sustained program, which is aimed to not only, I guess, identify the problems, because, we know what the problems are, but also, I guess, to use the speak of the day, sort of empower women to think about how to address some of the challenges that arise out of the workforce, particularly around research, because, of course, it's a research fellowship. So a lot of it is around research and how to sort of, work within the system and pursue your research career. But as Tiffany and Charlotte will tell you, both of whom have done the program, I think there are other layers that come into it. And that was the sort of unexpected excitement for me, that it's a research-framed mentoring program, but that within all of that, of course, what's going to come up are people's, personal challenges and some of the issues that Joy and Katie have articulated. But as I say, what was striking to me was the lack of anything. Now, I don't know what you do here at Deakin and Trobe. At Melbourne, I think, Julie, would be safe to say that, I've been there almost 25 years, and I think there's been a stop-start, fits and starts program. I myself did a fantastic mentoring program, I hate to think 16 years ago now, but there really isn't, and I've had discussions with senior management about this, there isn't anything that is in place. So that's how my program emerged, and I had funding for 10 places and I got 100 applications in the first year I offered it. So, there's a massive demand out there. There was a lot of interest in it. I'm running it again for the second time now, and again, same sort of interest in it. And what's striking about that is the need and the delinquent aspect of it in terms of the universities really not, meeting that need for women. And obviously it gives women an opportunity to network and meet other women and so on. There's that, because I was specific about making it Australia-wide, so women from humanities and social science come together. But really, when I speak to the women in the program, I mean, there is a general, not entirely, but general issue around what universities are offering. And I think it comes back to Julie's point about corporate universities, and I'll get to that. I can talk more about the mentoring program itself, but it's attracted such large numbers that, I'm trying to get more funding for it, and so I can fund more women to do it. But it really does speak to this. And so when we're looking at what we can do, I think it sounds like a fairly, basic thing, but offering some sort of program across universities is really a good start. And, maybe Tiffany and Charlotte can say more about the program. That's my first sort of point. It's a structural point about, proactive activity. Look, people don't have time, the resources are limited, and that's what happened at Melbourne. That program I did was cut back quite significantly because of resourcing. But again, it's about priorities, what's being prioritised within the university. The second issue really covers, I think, questions of what else to do within our universities. Now, I'm going to throw something out here, and many people might disagree with me, but I think these are the issues we need to talk about in terms of what do you do when you do have 25% of women at the senior level. In some universities it's 18% or 19%. And now the debate is divided on this. I'm very much on the record and on the public record as saying I'm very much supportive of the quota system. I think unless you have a quota system, nothing will change. And I know the debate's against it, but I have been talking about this issue at our university for 20 years, and you get hauled up to all the senior management consulting groups, and year after year they want your advice, you want your input. And I think unless there is a quota system, nothing will change. We will still be with under 30% women. And again, we can debate about the ins and outs of that, but I do think that other institutions in our society, the AFL, can you believe it, have stipulated that boards at football clubs will be a certain percentage, and they will not get their funding unless it is a certain percentage. The corporate sector, and a friend of mine who's in cultural, works in cultural institutions, and I were reflecting that universities and, cultural institutions where we've debated feminism for so long are so poor at representation, whereas the corporate sector and sporting groups, I never thought I'd live the day to see, sporting groups where they are now leading the way, frankly. So, what is that telling us about where we are at universities when the rest of society, frankly, is really embracing this in this way, like really pushing forward in areas you never thought would really embrace this. So whether people agree with the quota system or not, I was just going to quickly give an example in the maths department at Melbourne. Year after year, when they advertised for postdocs, no women would apply, or very few. So it was an all-male department, apart from a friend of mine who was one sole female professor. And so she took it upon herself, after being sick of this, to actually push through female-only postdocs. So they have 3 now, fantastic women in mathematics, male-dominated area, and they got exemption from the commission, whatever the commission is called now, to actually tag these as women only. And she said that has revolutionised the department. And the men were on board. I mean, you cannot have in this day and age an all-male department. Even if you oppose quotas. Well, you can, but it was the men too found that thought that was a real issue. Yes.
Don't know anything about it.
So, well, I mean, I guess it's, but this is what I'm saying. How do you bring about change? Often it is the women, unfortunately, who have to push this, but, men are on board as well, I think, at times. So I guess that's a second question I'd raise and put out there. How do you change it after 30, 40 years of this discussion, And the final point is really to pick up on some of the issues that Julie and Katie have talked about. I guess the broad umbrella point would be, how do we operate in a corporate university which has fundamentally destroyed collegiality, fundamentally destroyed a whole lot of values around working together? I think in my case, because the fellowship is based on a collaborative and collegial model, where I've got 2 postdocs and 4 PhDs working with me. It's a sort of island and oasis, actually, because the idea is to work together and produce work together. But I take Julie's point. I mean, it is really hard in an atomised environment that we're in now to actually bring these together, these parts together. I mean, I guess I would say that it's different, but it's possible. And I think Katie and Julie both indicated where it is possible, where you can work around grants and around other research projects. But it just takes a lot more work and it's a lot more labour intensive. It doesn't happen naturally. And I guess that leads to the question of the historiography, and Katie was talking about women's history, and of course, we were both part of that at that time. I don't think women's studies and those studies programs probably would survive now. I don't think the structure is such that it fosters collaboration or co-teaching or co-anything, at least at our university. And so I think that was a product of a particular time and place, that those studies programs which really did put together women's studies, American studies, Australian studies, but particularly feminism as a key category. And just as a spin-off from that, in my own research, refugee history, refugee studies is bereft of gender completely. And the question is why? Why would refugees in history be not ascribed with, gender and race and class?
It's even more startling than the environmental area.
Yeah, exactly. Really so refugee studies has been, really dominated by sociologists and others, and that's fine. But historians really haven't embraced the challenges of writing about refugees and refugee history within that. But I see that as a space to occupy and engage with and develop and push forward in a positive way. But so I suppose in my personal circumstance at the moment, it's running counter to a lot of these things, but that's not to say I'm not aware of them and what's going on around me. But just talking about the issues around women, I'm on the Gender Equity Committee for the ARC, and rope is a big question. I agree with Katie. I mean, rope is a major, major problem. It's not that people don't often take into account. I think one of the big issues is how you factor it into your decision. So what happens is you get an application and you think, okay, there's a rope issue there. And people go, yeah, that's terrible. Yeah, that's no good. Okay, fine. And then it's not like, okay, so what does that mean? 5 years of non-productivity? So we would factor that in. It's very hard to quantify a rope issue, and I think this is the challenge the ARC has. And the other thing I'd just add to that in conclusion is this notion of unconscious bias. I don't think there's anything unconscious about it at all. It's not unconscious. When a group of people see a woman who's a professor, they don't think professor. They think a woman. they see a male, they think professor, even if that male, it might be a senior sessional tutor. So there's coding around, we're hierarchical institutions, but it's coding around, yes, that gender is still there. And I don't think it's unconscious. I think it's very conscious. I think that's another issue. Language, I guess, is an issue here. I always challenge that. I say there's nothing unconscious about you just, hiring all male mathematicians to your positions. You look at yourself, you look at what you want yourself. And that's often the duplication. I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you. I do want to hand over to questions. Thank you for a great presentation from everyone, but I just thought I'd just give you a chance to talk to one another because I've been watching you write notes furiously about each other's papers and comments. So I thought I'd just open it out to the three of you first.
I think we're all saying the same thing.
I just think the rope issue is really interesting because there was a time when people wouldn't divulge even childcare responsibilities, and that's a really important issue, I think, what you're raising, because to then be punished for raising them is...
I think, can I just say that in defence of the ARC, that might be an assessor's
Oh,
report.
yeah, that's right. I'm not...
And all the material produced by the ARC, go on their website, they're very, very committed to this, and they're very committed to taking it on. The problem is, how do you factor it in? And it's a real issue. I mean, you can calculate. So one suggestion is to say, what is the average of somebody's productivity before the rope issue comes in? So let's say 2 publications a year. Rope kicks in over a 5-year period, and then post-rope it's 2 publications a year or 3. You take an average and you just include it in that rope era period. Otherwise, it's very, very hard, and it's not. It's I think well-meaning.
I don't say it's not well-meaning. It's just, the irony of that is incredible, and it's partly, the focus on quantifying output. I think the shift to that quantification has been really a problematic shift. If that's the only measurement, because it just then goes back to this so-called level playing field.
The other thing, can I just say about the rope issue is, it's astonishing to me how some, and I have to say it's gender-specific men, will take up that opportunity to talk about rope, and that's great, but often it's done in terms of issues that we wouldn't perceive to be rope issues. Yeah. And, I think sometimes it can be...
Like what, workload or...
No, workload sometimes, moving house.
Which is awful.
It is. It is terrible.
But perhaps not.
Anyway, I'll just leave it there. I won't give details, but, when you've got some, for example, Katie's given, as opposed to, I moved house, or I moved institutions within Melbourne. I mean, that to me is not a rope issue. So I think, you have to be clear about that. But, yeah, it does come up.
And, I mean, the advice I've been given to in that rope space is to say, okay, I've had to deal with all this, but I've still been able to do all this. So it's like you have to say, all that's happened, but in spite of that, I've still managed this. And, so it's almost like you can acknowledge it, but at the same time you have to kind of deny the level of impact. One of my friends says that for women, in the history context, each child is worth a book as a kind of rough, measurement.
All right, I might just get into the silence and go to Geelong and say, is there anyone at Geelong who has any comments or questions?
Well, I'll ask, and thanks very much, Julie, Katie, Joy. The question I have is, you're listing a lot of pretty ordinary practices. Have you seen anywhere else in other countries some better practices that might translate with a bit of work to our situation?
It's a good question.
Yeah. This is just a superficial observation of being in Denmark recently for a conference at the University of Copenhagen that Claire McCliskey had organised. And she was saying, and this was evident just in your observations, that people would leave at 4, men, women, everybody. And you could see this in the street, that you'd be walking around at 4 o'clock and men are out there with their families. It's very obvious that that's obviously a society-wide phenomenon, that commitment to family life, and that it being men and women who are involved in that. And it's got institutional support, but as I say, that's just an observation and something that I saw over a week. You don't see that here, where hours are just increasing.
I can't think of any particular examples that come to mind, actually.
I think it's very, David, I think it's very uneven. I mean, there'll be some institutions that do it better than others, but some universities do have a quota system, and that has borne fruit, like borne results. So I'd point to those, actually, Scandinavian largely, where they did lead the way, actually, in the quota system, just in general terms. But again, like in Australia, there's some, there's better practices in some institutions than others. Yeah.
Anyone else at Geelong?
Well, thanks for that. I think that was fascinating. And what really rings true to me after years of being in the sector is that argument about the neoliberal agenda really actually setting up all these tensions between, there's what we might aim to achieve and what we and the separation between the rhetoric and the reality. I think that's utterly true. And I wonder if one of the reasons why we struggle to identify other universities or other places where they do it better is that we're Anglophone, therefore we're all part of that whole neoliberal story, and that's utterly central to the ways in which it works. So I'm kind of, and I was really interested, and this goes to my experience and the experience of all of us, I suppose, about compliance, which is, in our face all the time, the whole question of compliance. And I was wondering if you'd like to expand on that a little bit, Julie, the idea of moving beyond compliance, because of course it is right out there in the rhetoric, and all we have to do is comply, and everything will live in some kind of utopia. But that, as we all know, is absolutely not the truth.
And we spend so much time doing it, and I work a lot with the community sector, and they employ people now in order, this is charities, in order to comply with government regulations. So part of your fundraising is to employ people in order to do compliance. Happens in the higher ed sector, TAFE, etc., extraordinary auditing. So, but that's more broadly. So I think what we mean by beyond compliance is partly for the reasons that I outlined that Sarah, Ahmed and others would say, but the other reason is for the area that I'm interested in particular, the relations between Indigenous peoples and the state, institutions have a key role to play in that. So that conceptual shift is really important, and part of that is examining your own history and your own practices. So as long as these practices remain external, compliance-based, abstract kind of documents, it's very difficult to do that kind of reflection. So for the University of Melbourne to undertake that conceptual shift, it needs people to articulate the possibilities of that. So it's not just to suggest it, but you've got to make it seem possible and practical. So it's really important, I think, to have a practical example of how that might be possible. So at Melbourne Uni, the LIME initiative, I think, which is where all of the 39 medical faculties around Australia have come alongside Melbourne University Medical in order to get more Indigenous peoples trained in medicine, and for those relationships to be very much place-based. So it's not just a compliance of training more people, but that the practice of that kind of employment and employing people in place and having relations with communities is essential to that program. And another institution would be Melbourne Museum, which has turned around their repatriation policy completely, as you would know, and Bunjalaka as well, a completely different exhibition to what it was, based on being in relation. So I think providing both the conceptual shift, what is it that you want to be rather than just simply compliant, important as that is, but also how you might go about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I love the sound of that, but I'm trying to think about how it works in the context of this kind of things that we've been talking about within a university, whereby I can see, and it comes down to who does the work, and who's going to do the emotional work that goes beyond the compliance stuff to create the right atmosphere, to create the mentoring situation, to do all that stuff. Who's going to do that? And is it going to end up being women again who are carrying that load?
I think it's a really good question, and it applies in the Indigenous space as well, because when you suggest this stuff, people always say, well, Indigenous people do that.
Yeah.
But that's exactly not the point. They're not the ones who are going to be doing it. So it is that shift in responsibility. And the workload, I agree with our project as well. The institution, because of its focus on quantitative measurement, made it very difficult for those of us who were setting up this project.
Can I sort of ask you to maybe comment a little bit more on that? Because that was exactly my thought, that, you know, both within the Minutes of Evidence project team, as you say, with a lot of part-time women having babies, all that kind of thing, and in terms of our relationships with partners, the amount of emotional and organisational work that had to happen to make that keep moving was immense. And, you know, from my kind of view of it, Julie, you carried an enormous burden as the lead CI, and that work doesn't get any visibility or acknowledgement in the outcome. You know, there's no way of quantifying that. And of course, when that work is being done, you're not doing, you know, we're not doing research, we're not doing, you know, those kinds of things. But it is absolutely necessary for those more easily quantifiable outcomes to occur. For the kind of research that we wanted to do, that work had to happen.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm thinking in a more kind of positive, sort of constructive take on that is do we need to find a language, or maybe it exists, for asserting in grant applications, in promotion applications, for asserting that and quantifying that work and that time.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, that may not change things immediately, but I think if we don't even have a kind of a language that we're developing to say this work is part of the research, this work is part of the project, and this is what it looks like, and this is how much time it takes. And that has to be factored into the cost of the project, the timing of the project, all those kinds of things. I don't feel like I've necessarily seen in things like ARC applications, or even in actually the way that we write up our research, where that is actually made explicit.
There's a few things to say to that. We did, the three of us who were in CRIM, did have a very supportive head of department at that stage, Steve James, and we put this argument to him, and he supported us doing our PDF process. This exact point that you can't get the research unless you have the relationships. It's just not going to happen. So that was really helpful for us to have a champion within the school who argued on our behalf. Secondly, I was level B when I started as lead CI of Minutes of Evidence. So over that time, that's 9 years ago now, I've been promoted twice. So that is a possibility within the promotion application to have a narrative. You can make the narrative. And you can make a narrative, as I did, around this conceptual shift and around responsibility. So this is how persuasive that narrative is, but that is a possibility. And then there's the irony, of course, now the institution values impact in a way that it didn't when we started. So
that's right.
when I started, you got capped at 5 points. So whether you had a partnership with 13 community partners and people of outcomes, or you wrote 3 articles of the conversation, you got 5 points capped. That's it. Whereas now you can... The institution supports being able to talk about impact.
Maybe that comes. I was just going to say that might, lead into that kind of this new focus on the term engagement, which is sort of seen as an output now.
Yes.
So, thinking about how that might be beneficial.
Turn it to your advantage.
But it's also, I guess, and particularly in terms of our conversation about gender, it's the internal relationships, and it's the maintaining of people who are having to step in and out of the project and their involvement.
Well, that's also about project management and research leadership, and those terms can certainly be used in that context. It doesn't capture everything. But if you are able to manage and lead a research team such that it can be productive, then then that's very, very valuable because lots of teams fall apart because they haven't got that cohesion. Exactly the sort of work that obviously Julie's been doing really well. You know, the CR's fracture or whatever happens.
I'm really sorry to stop the conversation, but someone else obviously needs the VMP, and we're coming up to the hour. So I guess I would just ask everyone to thank our speakers. And thanks David and all the Geelong people for coming along, and thanks to David and Philip, and we'll see you next time.
And thanks to Celeste Thorne as well. She's done a lot of work
She
for
did a lot of
these
organising.
seminars.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.